The millionaire arrives unexpectedly, and the maid tells him to shut up, don't make a sound. The reason. Julian Sterling had never felt such relief stepping onto American soil after 3 months of exhausting meetings in the United Kingdom. The 42-year-old businessman had closed multi-million-dollar contracts, but all he desired now was the comfort of his mansion in the Upper East Side of New York City. When he inserted the key into the lock of the main door, he planned to surprise Martha, his trusted housekeeper of 15 years. But as soon as the door opened, she came running down the marble hallway, her eyes wide with panic. Without hesitation, she placed her hand over his mouth, whispering desperately. "Mr. Julian, for God's sake, don't make a sound," murmured Martha, her hands trembling as she held his arm. Julian stepped back, confused and irritated. Martha looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles that weren't there when he left for London. Her grey hair, always impeccably tied in a bun, was now dishevelled. "What's going on here, Martha?" he asked in a low voice, more out of instinct than understanding. "Your mother is here," she replied, and the words came out like a breath laden with fear. Julian felt his blood run cold. His mother, Mrs. Eleanor, had been at Oakwood Gardens Manor for 8 months. The diagnosis of senile dementia had been devastating, but he had chosen the best private institution in New York City, paying millions of dollars monthly for specialized care. "What do you mean she's here?" he questioned, his voice rising a tone before Martha made an urgent gesture for silence. "She escaped from the manor 2 weeks ago," Martha confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "I found her wandering the street, Mr. Julian. She was thin, dirty, afraid of everything and everyone." The businessman felt his legs wobble. Martha guided him to the living room, away from the staircase leading to the guest rooms on the 2nd floor. There she told him in detail how she had found the 73-year-old woman lost on 5th Avenue, wearing only a torn hospital gown and mismatched slippers. "She didn't recognize me at first," Martha continued, wiping her tears with her white apron. "She was frightened, talking nonsense, saying she needed to find the son who had promised to return." Julian ran his hands through his perfectly combed hair, feeling guilt begin to gnaw at his stomach. He had visited his mother only 3 times in the 8 months of her stay, always in a hurry, always with excuses about urgent commitments. "Why didn't you call me? Why did you hide this from me?" he asked, trying to control the irritation masking his desperation. "Because you were traveling, closing important deals," Martha replied with painful simplicity. "And because she begged not to go back to that place." Her words echoed through the luxurious room, decorated with expensive artwork and imported furniture that suddenly seemed insignificant. Julian stood up abruptly, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city. "What do you know about the conditions at the manor?" he asked, still with his back to her. Martha hesitated for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with a sadness that seemed to come from very far away. "Mr. Julian, I don't know if I should tell you everything I found out." He turned quickly, staring at her with an intensity she had rarely seen. "Tell me everything. Now." "Your mother arrived here weighing 33 pounds less than when she was admitted," Martha began, her words coming out like little stabs. "She had purple marks on her arms where they applied excessive sedatives. She talked about nurses who yelled at patients and about spoiled food that was served daily." Julian felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. Oakwood Gardens Manor had an impeccable reputation, cost millions of dollars monthly, promised humane treatment, and a family-like environment. "She said she tried to call you several times, but they always said you were too busy to take calls from patients," Martha continued, each word hanging in the air like lead. "She even wrote letters, but they were never sent." "Where are those letters?" Julian asked, his voice coming out hoarse. "In her room, along with other things I managed to recover when I went back to the manor to fetch her personal belongings." Julian headed for the stairs with determined steps, but Martha held him by the arm. "Mr. Julian, she still gets confused sometimes. There are moments when she doesn't even recognize me. You need to be patient." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. Ascending the marble steps he had always considered a symbol of his success, Julian now felt they were a path toward his own condemnation. Martha followed him in silence, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rug covering the second-floor hallway. She stopped in front of the door to the third guest room, the one that always remained closed because it had the best view of the garden. With a delicate gesture, she turned the golden doorknob. The scene Julian encountered made him choke on his own breath. His mother, Mrs. Eleanor, was sitting in an armchair near the window, watching the golden maples blooming in the garden. She wore one of the dresses Martha had bought, simple but clean, and her grey hair was combed with care. "Mother?" he whispered, approaching slowly. "Mrs." Eleanor turned her face toward him, and Julian saw in her eyes a mixture of recognition and confusion that made him feel as if he were drowning on dry land. You are my son?" she asked with a fragile voice he barely recognized. "It's me, Mother, Julian." She studied his face for long seconds, as if trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle too complex for her tired mind. "Julian promised he'd come back," she murmured, looking out the window again. "But he never does." Her words were like a punch to the gut. Julian knelt beside the armchair, taking her hands in his. They were cold and thinner than he remembered, the skin almost transparent and marked by small bruises. "I came back, Mother. I'm here now." "Why did you abandon me?" she asked, turning to him with a sudden lucidity that haunted him. "Why did you put me in that horrible place?" Julian couldn't answer. The tears he had been holding back for so long finally began to stream down his face. Martha, who was watching from the door, approached and knelt on the other side of the armchair. "Mrs. Eleanor, Julian was working far away, remember? Now he's come back to stay with you." The elderly woman looked from one to the other, her expression alternating between confusion and a deep pain that seemed to come from some very old place in her soul. "In that place they gave me medicine that made me sleep all day," she began to recount, her voice gaining strength. "They said I was troublesome when I asked for my son. A nurse said I'd been abandoned because I was a burden." Julian felt as if he were being strangled. Martha took Mrs. Eleanor's hand, offering the silent comfort she had given during the previous 2 weeks. "The food tasted bad, and when we complained they increased the medicine," she continued. "Many of the other elderly people cried at night. I cried too, but quietly, because I didn't want to be a bother." "Mother, I didn't know." "I swear I didn't know." "You never asked," she replied with devastating simplicity. "You paid and left, as if I were a bill that needed to be settled." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of city traffic outside. Julian realized he had built an entire life running from emotional responsibilities, outsourcing even the love he owed his own mother. "Martha brought me home," Mrs. Eleanor said, smiling weakly at the housekeeper. "She gave me a warm bath, good food, and let me sleep without those horrible medicines. For the first time in months, I was able to dream of good things." Julian looked at Martha, trying to process the magnitude of what she had done. Not only had she taken in his mother in secret, but she had provided the care that he, her own son, had neglected. "Martha, I need to know exactly how you found her." The housekeeper took a deep breath before beginning to tell her story. 2 weeks prior, she was returning from the supermarket when she saw an elderly lady sitting on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, near a bus stop. She was clearly lost, talking to herself and shivering from cold, despite the day being warm. "I approached slowly, because she seemed frightened of everything," Martha recounted. "When I asked if she needed help, she told me she had gone out to look for her son. She said she lived in a place where they hurt people, but that she had forgotten the way home." "How did you know it was her?" "She said your name several times. Julian Sterling," she kept saying. "He lives in a big house with a garden of golden maples." My heart stopped when I realized she was describing our house. Martha explained that she took Mrs. Eleanor home immediately, gave her a bath and food, and tried to calm her agitated state. The elderly woman slept for 14 hours straight, waking up more lucid than she had been in months. "In the first few days, she told me stories about her childhood, about you when you were a boy, about her husband who died in the war. They were clear, detailed memories. I realized her mind was much better than the doctors at the manor made it seem." Julian rose from his kneeling position. His legs were numb, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight he felt in his chest. He walked to the dresser where Martha had organized his mother's personal belongings. Among the old photos and the few items she had managed to bring from the manor, there was a bundle of letters tied with a faded red string. The letters his mother had written to him during her stay, all addressed to his office, none ever sent. With trembling hands, Julian opened the first letter. His mother's handwriting, once firm and elegant, was now shaky but still legible. "My dear son, today marks 1 week I've been here. The place is beautiful on the outside, but inside the people are not kind. I try to understand why you brought me here, but I can't. Did I do something wrong? You promised you would come visit me every week, but you haven't come yet. Perhaps you are very busy with business. I understand, I always have. I just wanted to hear your voice on the phone, even if just for a few minutes. I love you, my son, Mum." Julian closed his eyes, feeling as if each word were an ember being pressed against his heart. There were dozens of similar letters, each one recording the gradual deterioration of a mother's hope as she waited for the son who never appeared. "Why couldn't she call me?" he asked, his voice coming out as a whisper. According to Mrs. Eleanor, whenever she asked to use the phone, they told her you had left instructions not to be disturbed with calls from patients. Martha answered. She even begged them to call in emergencies, but they always convinced her there was no emergency at all. Reality began to take shape in Julian's mind, like a photographic negative slowly developing. He had never given such instructions. In fact, he had specifically requested to be notified about any situation involving his mother. "They lied to her," he murmured, more to himself than to the other 2 people in the room. "Mr. Julian," Martha said hesitantly, "there are other things I discovered about that facility, things you perhaps should know." Mrs. Eleanor, who had remained quiet during the conversation, suddenly stirred in her armchair. "They hurt your George too," she said, referring to another patient. "He tried to escape 3 times, but they always brought him back. The last time, they put him in a locked room and we couldn't see him anymore." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. The facility had reported that Mr. Harrison had been transferred to an institution specializing in more severe cases, but they never provided specific details when he asked about other patients during his rare visits. "Mother, do you remember other patients who were mistreated?" Mrs. Eleanor's lucidity seemed to come and go like waves, but when it was present, it was impressively detailed. She began to tell him about Mrs. Catherine, who was forced to take medications even when she said they made her feel ill, about her John, who was hit by the nurses when he tried to get out of bed at night, about Mrs. Rose, who cried, asking to speak to her daughter, but was never attended to. "Julian," she said, taking his hand with more strength than he expected, "you need to help the others too. They are still there suffering." The responsibility that had fallen on Julian's shoulders was overwhelming. Not only had he failed his own mother, but he discovered he had inadvertently contributed to a system that mistreated vulnerable people. "Martha, I need to better understand how you discovered all this information. My mother was very confused when she was admitted. How can she be so lucid now?" The housekeeper looked at Mrs. Eleanor with affection before answering. "Mr. Julian, in the 2 weeks she has been here, I have only given her the essential medications the family doctor prescribed after I took her for a checkup. We discovered she was being medicated with very high doses of sedatives, far beyond what would be necessary for her actual condition." "You took her to the doctor without my permission?" "Yes, sir, and I apologize for that. But she was clearly being over-medicated. Dr. Arthur confirmed that the medications she was taking at the facility could cause mental confusion, temporary memory loss, and disorientation." Julian had known Dr. Arthur Vance for years. He was the family physician, someone he trusted completely. If he had confirmed Martha's suspicion about over-medication, then there was real substance to the accusations against the facility. What else did Dr. Arthur say? That Mrs. Eleanor's current state is much better than expected for someone with dementia at the stage she was diagnosed. He suspects the initial diagnosis may have been exaggerated, or that her condition was artificially worsened by the medications. The implications of this revelation were terrifying. If the diagnosis had been exaggerated, it meant his mother had been subjected to months of unnecessary suffering. If the medication had artificially aggravated her condition, then the facility was guilty of serious medical negligence. "Martha, why did you do all this? Why did you risk your job, your safety, to care for my mother?" The question seemed to touch something deep within her. Martha lowered her eyes, her hands nervously fidgeting with the fabric of her apron. "Because I lost my own mother in a similar way," she answered, her voice almost inaudible. "5 years ago, I placed her in a facility when I could no longer care for her alone. They promised specialized care, a family-like environment. 3 months later, she died. When I went to collect her belongings, I discovered she had been neglected, mistreated, over-medicated." Tears streamed down Martha's face as she continued. "I swore to myself I would never let that happen to anyone again, if I could help it. When I saw Mrs. Eleanor lost on the street, I saw my own mother asking for a second chance I couldn't give her." The weight of this revelation made Julian sink heavily onto the bed near the armchair where his mother rested. Martha had carried this guilt and pain alone for 5 years, and yet had risked everything to save a person she barely knew personally. "Why did you never tell me about your mother?" "Because you already had your own troubles, Mr. Julian, and because I didn't want my experiences to influence your decisions about Mrs. Eleanor. But when I found her in that state, I couldn't ignore the signs." Mrs. Eleanor, who had been following the conversation with varying attention, suddenly took Martha's hand. "You saved 2 mothers," she said with surprising clarity. "Yours by honoring her memory, and me by giving me a second chance." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell echoing through the mansion. Martha stiffened immediately, her eyes filling with fear. "Mr. Julian, there's something I need to tell you before I answer the door." "What is it?" "The director of the manor has been calling every day since Mrs. Eleanor disappeared. Yesterday he threatened to come in person if she wasn't returned today. I think it's him at the door." Julian felt a wave of anger course through his body. The audacity of someone from the manor coming to his home, especially after everything he had discovered about the treatment his mother received, was unacceptable. "Stay here with my mother," he said, rising with determination. "I will handle this now." "Mr. Julian," he said, "he has legal authorization to take Mrs. Eleanor back. Something about her being considered a fugitive patient." The information made Julian stop at the bedroom door. He had signed extensive documents when he admitted his mother, giving the manor medical authority over her. At the time, it seemed the responsible decision of someone who wanted to ensure the best possible care. Now, those same documents could be used against her. "Martha, in my office, the right desk drawer, there's a blue folder with all the manor's documentation. Bring it to me, please." As Martha went to fetch the documents, Julian went down the stairs quickly, thinking about his legal options. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. When he opened the door, he found a man of about 50, wearing a grey suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His face wore an expression of artificial authority that Julian immediately recognized as belonging to someone used to intimidating people in vulnerable situations. "Mr. Sterling, I am Dr. Gregory Thorne, Administrative Director of Oakwood Gardens Manor. I believe we know why I'm here." "Actually, Dr. Thorne, I would like to know a few things myself." "Come in." The director seemed surprised by the reception, clearly expecting resistance or direct confrontation. Julian guided him to the living room, maintaining a cordial tone that masked the growing fury in his chest. "Mr. Sterling, our patient. Eleanor Sterling left the manor 2 weeks ago without medical authorization. We have reason to believe she is being kept at this residence against established treatment protocols." "Patient?" Julian repeated, his voice laden with irony. "I'd like to better understand the treatment protocols you're referring to. Your mother was under specialized care for advanced dementia. Abandoning treatment can result in serious deterioration of her condition, in addition to representing legal risks for anyone sheltering her without proper medical supervision." Conceição came down the stairs at that moment, carrying the blue folder and a second folder that Roberto did not immediately recognize. She handed both to him with a meaningful look. "Dr. Ferreira, before we discuss my mother's return, I would like to clarify some discrepancies in the treatment she received at the clinic. I don't understand what you're referring to." Roberto opened the first folder, Pulling out the monthly medical reports the clinic had sent during his mother's stay, he compared them with the contents of the second folder, which he discovered contained notes Conceição had made about Mrs. Eleanor's condition since bringing her home. According to your reports, my mother exhibited severe cognitive deterioration, requiring heavy medication to control episodes of agitation. However, in the 2 weeks she has spent under home care, with minimal medication, she demonstrates much greater lucidity and stability. Mr. Sterling, fluctuations in the condition of dementia patients are normal. That does not mean the treatment was inadequate. I would also like to understand why my mother never received the calls I requested be made weekly, and why the letters she wrote were never sent. Dr. Ferreira adjusted his tie, a subtle sign of nervousness that did not go unnoticed by Roberto. We have strict protocols regarding communication with family members. All contact attempts are properly logged. Show me those logs. Mr. Sterling, I cannot expose confidential information of other patients or operational details of the clinic. My function today is to ensure your mother returns to appropriate medical care. Roberto closed the folders harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Dr. Ferreira, my mother will not be returning to your clinic. Consider our contractual relationship terminated as of today. I'm afraid it's not that simple. Your mother has been declared incapable of making medical decisions for herself. The documents you signed give us legal authority over her treatment. Those documents were signed based on information I now suspect to be false or exaggerated. I intend to legally contest any authority the clinic claims over my mother. The director opened his leather briefcase, taking out official documents which he placed on the coffee table. Mr. Sterling, here is a temporary court order authorizing the removal of Eleanor Sterling from this residence for independent medical evaluation. If you interfere with this process, you could face charges of obstruction of justice. Roberto felt the floor fall away beneath his feet. Conceição, who had remained standing near the stairs, approached discreetly. How did you get a court order so quickly? The clinic has established protocols for cases of runaway patients. When there is a risk to public health or to the patient themselves, the judiciary acts with urgency. Risk to public health. Dementia patients can pose a danger to themselves and others when not properly supervised. Your housekeeper, though well-intentioned, lacks the medical qualifications to care for a complex case like your mother's. Roberto looked at Conceição, who remained silent but with an expression he couldn't completely decipher. There was something in her eyes that suggested knowledge or information she had not yet shared. Mr. Sterling, I need you to call your mother here so we can proceed with the transfer in a civilized manner. No. The answer came out louder than Roberto intended. Dr. Ferreira seemed genuinely surprised by the direct resistance. Mr. Sterling, the court order is not a suggestion. It is a legal determination that must be complied with. Then you'll have to enforce it, because my mother will not voluntarily leave this house to return to a place where she was mistreated. Mistreated? Mr. Sterling, those are very serious accusations. Oakwood Gardens Manor has an impeccable reputation, and 15 years of service without a single formal complaint. No formal complaints because you prevent patients from communicating with their families. The confrontation was interrupted by a frail voice from the top of the staircase. Julian, what is happening? Everyone looked up and saw Mrs. Eleanor slowly descending the steps, leaning on the banister. Martha immediately went up to help her, but the elderly woman gestured that she could manage on her own. When she reached the living room, Mrs. Eleanor looked directly at Dr. Thorne, and Julian saw something change in her expression. Fear returned to her eyes, and she instinctively positioned herself behind the armchair, as if seeking protection. Mrs. Eleanor, I am Dr. Thorne, from the facility where you were receiving treatment. We've come to take you back to continue your treatment. I don't want to go back, she said, her voice coming out as a frightened whisper. Please, don't make me go back. Ma'am, you are unwell and require specialized care that we can only provide at our facility. I am feeling well here, Mrs. Eleanor replied, her voice gaining a little more strength. Martha takes care of me. Julian has returned. I don't need those medicines anymore that made me sleep all day. Julian positioned himself between his mother and the facility director. Doctor, Thorne, as you can see, my mother is lucid and clearly expressing her will. She does not wish to return. Mr. Sterling, patients with dementia often lack the capacity to make rational decisions about their own care. That is why the responsibility falls upon the family and the medical team. She seems perfectly capable of expressing her preferences. Moments of lucidity are common, but they do not indicate full recovery. Proper treatment requires constant medical supervision. Martha, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, suddenly addressed Dr. Thorne. "Doctor, do you remember me?" The director looked at her carefully for the first time, his expression showing signs of gradual recognition. "I don't believe so. Should I?" "My name is Martha Miller. 5 years ago, my mother, Mary Miller, was a patient at your facility." Dr. Thorne's face visibly paled. Julian noticed the change and turned to Martha with renewed interest. "What happened to your mother at the facility?" Julian asked. "The same thing that was happening to Mrs. Eleanor: excessive medication, isolation from family, neglect of basic care. My mother passed away at the facility 3 months after admission, under conditions I only discovered later." "Mrs. Miller," the director interjected quickly, "your mother had a complex medical condition. We did everything possible within established medical protocols." "Did the medical protocols include sedating her until she could no longer get out of bed? Did they include denying her food when she refused medication? Did they include preventing her from speaking to me on the phone during her final months?" Julian felt as if he were seeing the pieces of a macabre puzzle fitting together before his eyes. Martha wasn't just an employee who had saved his mother out of kindness. She was a daughter seeking some form of redemption for what had happened to her own mother. "Martha, you worked for me for 15 years. Why did you never tell me about your mother?" "Because it was a private pain, Mr. Julian, and because I had no proof of what happened, until now." She turned to the second folder she had brought from the office, pulling out documents Julian did not recognize. "During these 2 weeks caring for Mrs. Eleanor, I kept a detailed record of everything. Medication schedules, reactions, levels of lucidity, statements she made about the treatment at the manor. I also photographed the marks on her arms and her general state of health when she arrived here." "This evidence was collected without medical or legal authorization," Mr. Thorne protested. "It has no validity." "Perhaps it has no legal validity," Martha replied, "but it has moral validity, and I'm sure other patients' relatives would like to see it." The threat was implicit, but clear. Julian realized Martha had been building a case against the manor for weeks, using the care of his mother as an opportunity to gather evidence. "Mrs. Miller, any attempt to defame our institution based on unfounded allegations will result in legal action against you." "Mr. Thorne," Julian intervened, "I believe we have reached an impasse. My mother will not return to the manor today. If you wish to proceed legally, then do so. But I will not allow her to be removed from this house against her express will." The director put the documents back into his briefcase with abrupt movements, clearly frustrated with how the situation had unfolded. "Mr. Sterling, you are making a grave mistake. The legal costs of this decision will be substantial, and your mother will not receive the care she needs." "Mr. Thorne, the real costs have already been paid. By my mother, by Martha's mother, and probably by many other patients whose families trusted your manor." After the director left, the house was enveloped in a heavy silence. Julian helped his mother sit in the living room armchair, noticing how her hands still trembled slightly. "Mother, are you all right?" "I'm afraid, Julian. I'm afraid they'll come for me during the night." The vulnerability in her voice broke Julian's heart. He knelt beside the armchair, holding his mother's trembling hands in his own. "I promise I won't let that happen. You will stay here at home where you belong." "But what if they come back with more papers, with more people?" Julian had no answer for that. The court order presented by Mr. Thorne seemed legitimate, and he knew his resistance could have serious legal consequences. But looking at his mother's face, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, he couldn't imagine handing her back to the care of people who had clearly mistreated her. "Martha, I need to better understand what you collected about the manor. If we are going to face this legally, we need to have the strongest possible case." During the following hours, Martha presented Julian with meticulous documentation she had compiled during the 2 weeks of caring for Mrs. Eleanor. Photographs of unexplained bruises, detailed records of the medication she was taking versus what she actually needed, audio recordings of the statements his mother had made about the treatment at the manor. "Martha, this is professional investigative work. How did you know what to document?" "After my mother passed, I spent months researching negligence in healthcare institutions. I learned what kind of evidence would be necessary if I ever had the chance to expose what happened." "You planned this. It wasn't a coincidence that you found my mother on the street." Martha lowered her eyes, and Julian saw guilt and determination wrestling in her expression. "No, Mr. Sterling. Finding Mrs. Eleanor was a real coincidence. But when I realized who she was and where she had fled from, I saw an opportunity to finally get the justice I couldn't get for my own mother." "You used my family for your own vendetta." The accusation came out harsher than Julian had intended. Martha raised her eyes, and he saw tears forming, but also a fierce determination. "I used your family to save your mother and expose crimes that are still happening. If that's revenge, then yes, it was revenge, but it was also love." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The tension between Julian and Martha was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of another visitor. Dr. Arthur Vance, the family physician, appeared at the door, carrying a bulky folder and with a grim expression. "Julian, Martha called me and told me about the clinic director's visit. I brought some test results you need to see." The doctor had known Mrs. Eleanor for over 20 years, guiding the entire family through various medical situations. His opinion on her current state carried the weight of experience and mutual trust. "Dr. Vance, what did the tests show?" Julian asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Eleanor is in much better condition than anyone with advanced dementia should be. The neurological exams show cognitive function significantly higher than what was reported by the clinic." The doctor opened his folder, showing MRI images and detailed cognitive test results. Even more concerning, the blood tests revealed traces of heavy sedative medications that shouldn't be present in someone who stopped taking that medication 2 weeks ago. This suggests she was being medicated far beyond actual clinical needs. "What does this mean legally?" Julian asked. "It means we have objective medical evidence that the treatment Eleanor was receiving was inadequate and potentially harmful. This can be used to challenge any legal authority the clinic claims over her." Mrs. Eleanor, who had been listening to the conversation from her armchair, suddenly spoke up. "Dr. Vance, they gave me injections that made me sleep for hours. When I tried to refuse, they said it was on my son's orders." The doctor knelt beside her, speaking with the paternal kindness Julian remembered from his own childhood. "Eleanor, do you remember how many times a day you received those injections?" 3, sometimes 4. In the morning, after lunch, in the evening, and when I complained about something. Dr. Vance looked at Julian with a grave expression. "Julian, this level of sedation is completely unnecessary and dangerous for someone in Eleanor's condition. It can cause artificial cognitive deterioration, muscle weakness, and a host of other health problems. Doctor, legally speaking, what can I do with this information?" "First, we can request an independent medical evaluation to officially establish that Eleanor does not require involuntary commitment. Second, this evidence of mistreatment may be enough to invalidate the documents you originally signed." Hope began to rekindle in Julian's chest. For the first time since arriving home, he felt there was a legal way out to protect his mother. How long could this process take? "The independent evaluation can be done this week. To invalidate the clinic's authority, perhaps a few weeks, but I can provide an immediate medical statement affirming that Eleanor is in stable condition and poses no risk to herself or others." Martha, who had remained quiet during the conversation with the doctor, suddenly stood up and walked to the window. "Mr. Sterling, there's a car parked in front of the house that's been there for 2 hours." Everyone moved to the window and saw a grey sedan with 2 men inside, clearly watching the property. Julian felt a wave of indignation surge through his body. "They're watching us." "It appears so," observed Dr. Arthur. The manor is likely trying to ensure Eleanor isn't removed from the property before they can secure legal reinforcement. Is that legal? Technically, they're on public property, but it's clear intimidation. Julian made a quick decision. He picked up the phone and called his personal lawyer, explaining the situation in detail. During the 20-minute conversation, he arranged immediate legal defense and requested action be taken against the manor's harassment. Mr. Harrison will secure a temporary restraining order against the manor until we can resolve this through the proper legal channels, Julian informed the group after hanging up. What about the surveillance? Martha asked, still watching the car on the street. He's sending a private investigator to document and, if necessary, confront the situation. Mrs. Eleanor, who had followed all these legal maneuvers attentively, suddenly seemed to withdraw into herself. Julian, you're spending so much money because of me. Mother, there's no such thing as too much money when it comes to your safety and dignity. But what if I die soon? All this effort will be wasted. Her question hit Julian like a punch to the stomach. His mother was expressing a genuine worry about being a financial and emotional burden, even in a situation where she was clearly the victim. Mother, you are not going to die soon. And even if you had little time left, it would be my privilege to spend every penny I have to ensure that time is dignified and happy. At the manor, they said I was costing too much and that my family was probably resenting the expenses. The revelation of yet another form of psychological abuse inflicted by the manor made Julian feel an anger so intense his hands began to tremble. Mother, I have never ever resented the costs of your care. If anyone told you that, they were lying cruelly. Dr. Arthur approached Mrs. Eleanor with a gentle but serious expression. Eleanor, that kind of comment is a form of psychological abuse. Unsuitable institutions sometimes use these tactics to make patients more submissive and less likely to complain. How many other people are going through this right now? She asked, tears beginning to roll down her face. The question echoed through the room with the weight of a moral responsibility none of them could ignore. Julian realized his fight to protect his mother was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Martha, you said you collected evidence. Would it be enough for a formal investigation of the manor? With what I have on Mrs. Eleanor and what I discovered about my own mother, perhaps, but it would be much stronger if other patients' family members came forward. How do we find these people? Public records, obituaries, any family who had loved ones at the manor in recent years. But it will be a long and painful process. Julian looked at his mother, seeing in her eyes a mixture of weariness and determination that surprised him. Julian, if I can help stop other families from going through what we have, I want to help. Mother, this could be very stressful for you. Son, I spent 8 months being mistreated every day. Talking about it to stop it from happening to others can't be worse than that. His mother's courage humbled Julian. At 73, after months of trauma, she was willing to relive her painful experiences to protect strangers. It was a display of character he wasn't sure he possessed. The private investigator hired by his lawyer arrived 2 hours later. Frank Malone was a former police detective who now worked primarily on cases of corporate fraud and institutional negligence. Mr. Sterling, I documented the illegal surveillance and confronted the individuals in the car. They claimed to be on public property, but when I mentioned they were being filmed, they left immediately. What does that mean? It means they know they're treading on legally questionable ground. It also suggests they have something to hide, or they wouldn't have backed down so quickly. Gregory had brought equipment to record Mrs. Eleanor's formal testimony about her experiences at the manor. The process took 2 hours, with frequent breaks to allow her to rest or deal with the emotional distress of recalling traumatic events. The testimony that emerged was devastating. Mrs. Eleanor described in vivid detail how she was awakened every morning with painful injections, how she was forced to eat spoiled food or go hungry, how she was ridiculed by staff when she asked to speak with her son. Mrs. Eleanor, do you remember the names of other patients who were mistreated? George Harrison, Catherine Brooks, John Miller, Rose Beckett. There are many others, but I remember these well because we would talk when the nurses weren't looking. Do you know what happened to them? George disappeared after he tried to escape for the 3rd time, Catherine grew thinner and thinner because she refused to eat the bad food. John stopped speaking after he was beaten by the nurses. Rose cried so much until they started giving her stronger medication. Each name was meticulously noted by the investigator. Each story represented a family that possibly didn't know about the suffering their loved one had endured. Mr. Sterling, with this testimony and the medical evidence, we have a solid basis for a formal investigation, but we need to be prepared for retaliation from the manor. What kind of retaliation? Defamation lawsuits, attempts to invalidate the evidence, pressure on medical authorities to question the competence of the doctors supporting you. These institutions have substantial resources and political connections. Julian felt the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. It wasn't just about protecting his mother, but about confronting an entire system that profited from the suffering of vulnerable people. Martha, are you still willing to proceed with this knowing the risks? Mr. Julian, my mother died alone and frightened in that manner. If there's a chance to stop that from happening to others, the risks are worth it. And you, Mother, are you sure you want to expose yourself to this? Mrs. Eleanor looked out the window where the surveillance car had been, then turned to her son with a determination he hadn't seen in years. Julian, when you were a child, I always said the most important person in the world is the one who defends those who can't defend themselves. Now it's me who needs to defend people in the situation I was in. The decision was made. Julian, Martha, and Mrs. Eleanor would commit to a legal battle that could last months or years, but that offered the possibility of exposing and reforming a care system that had failed tragically. That night, after all the visitors had left, Julian sat by his mother's bedside as she prepared to sleep. It was the first time in 8 months he had done so, and the simplicity of the moment moved him deeply. Julian, can I tell you a secret? Of course, Mother. On the hardest nights at the manor, I imagined you would appear at my bedroom door to say good night, like you did when you were a child. The tears Julian had held back all day finally came. He held his mother's hand, feeling how it still carried the softness he remembered from his childhood, despite all she had suffered. Mother, I promise that every night from now on, I will be here to say good night, even when I forget who you are, especially when you forget who I am. Martha watched from the doorway, giving them privacy, but ensuring Mrs. Eleanor was safe. When Julian left the room, she was waiting for him in the hallway. Mr. Julian, there's something I need to tell you about my real reasons for working here. What is it? When I started working for your family 15 years ago, it wasn't just because I needed the job. I had lost my own son in an accident, and taking care of you, even though you were an adult, somehow helped me cope with that loss. Julian sat down heavily on the stairs, processing yet another revelation that changed his understanding of everything that had happened. You never told me you had a son. Because the pain was too great. But when your mother was hospitalized, I felt like I was losing another person I love. And when I found her on the street, I felt as if the universe was giving me a chance to save someone I couldn't save before. Martha, why are you telling me this now? Because tomorrow our lives are going to change. We're entering a legal battle that will expose many painful truths. I want you to know that no matter what happens, these 15 years caring for your family gave me a purpose I had lost. And if we lose, if the facility manages to take my mother back, then at least we will have tried, and your mother will know she wasn't abandoned again. The next morning, the house was transformed into an informal operations center. Julian's lawyer, Mr. Harrison, arrived early with a team of legal assistants. The investigator, Gregory, returned with information about other suspicious cases involving the facility. Dr. Arthur brought colleague specialists willing to evaluate Mrs. Eleanor's case. The first significant development came when the investigator presented evidence that Oakwood Gardens Manor had faced similar complaints in other states, but all had been resolved through quiet settlements that included confidentiality clauses. Mr. Sterling, I found at least 6 families in the last 3 years who sued the facility for negligence. All received substantial financial compensation, but were prohibited from speaking publicly about their experiences. Does that mean the facility knows it's doing something wrong and is paying to keep it secret? Exactly. And it suggests your mother's case is not isolated, but part of a systematic pattern. The revelation energized the whole team. Mr. Harrison explained that patterns of misconduct were far more powerful legally than isolated cases, no matter how well documented. Julian, if we can contact some of these families and convince them to break their silence, we can turn this from an individual case into a class action. But can't they speak because of the confidentiality clauses? Technically, no. But if we can get independent evidence of the same problems they faced, their clauses could be invalidated on grounds of public interest. Martha, who had been organizing the documents on Mrs. Eleanor, suddenly looked up. Mr. Harrison, I may have a way to contact these families without violating their legal restrictions. How? Through facility employees who were fired or resigned in recent years. They aren't covered by the confidentiality clauses and may have information about specific cases. The idea was brilliant. Gregory immediately began researching former facility employees, while Mr. Harrison prepared documents to protect anyone who decided to cooperate with the investigation. During these preparations, Mrs. Eleanor remained the center of attention, but in a way that dignified her rather than objectified her. Each person who arrived was introduced to her respectfully, and her opinions about the process were sought and respected. Mr. Eleanor, we are preparing your formal statement for the courts. Is there any part of your experience you would prefer not to discuss publicly? Mr. Harrison, if my humiliation can prevent others from going through the same thing, then I want everything to be told. The strength of character shown by a 73-year-old woman who had been systematically abused humbled everyone present. Julian felt proud to be her son in a way he hadn't felt in decades. The first former employee who agreed to speak was Sarah Jenkins, a nurse who had worked at the manor for 3 years before being fired for insubordination, which turned out to be her refusal to administer unnecessary sedatives to patients. The manor has 2 faces, Sarah explained during a recorded meeting at Julian's house. To the families and inspectors, everything seems professional and caring. But in the day-to-day, patients are treated like animals that cost too much money. Can you give specific examples? I received direct instructions from Mr. Thorne to keep patients quiet and manageable using sedation, regardless of actual medical need. When I questioned this, I was told families pay for peace of mind, not for optimal medical care. Did you know Eleanor Sterling? Yes, she was one of the sweetest and least troublesome patients we had. There was no medical reason for the heavy sedation she received, except to make the routine easier for the staff. Sarah's testimony was devastating, but it was only the beginning. In the following days, other former employees began to come forward, each adding pieces to a puzzle of systematic neglect and institutionalized abuse. Teresa Miller, a nursing assistant, revealed how patients were often left in unsanitary conditions to force families to pay for premium care. Joseph Beckett, a nutrition technician, described how the low-quality food was intentional, creating health problems that justified additional medication and more expensive treatments. How many patients do you estimate were affected by these practices? Mr. Harrison asked Joseph. During the 2 years I worked there, I would say every patient was affected in some way, some more, some less, but all were harmed by the manor's policies. Every single one. Mr. Harrison, the manor operates as a business first and a care center second. Every decision is made to maximize profits, not to maximize patient well-being. The magnitude of what was being revealed was overwhelming. Julian realized they weren't dealing with a few bad employees or isolated misguided policies, but with a deliberate and systematic operation to exploit families in moments of extreme vulnerability. Julian, Mr. Harrison said after a week of testimonies, we have enough evidence for a criminal case beyond the civil suits. This goes beyond medical negligence and enters the territory of organized fraud. What's the practical difference? Criminal cases can result in the closure of the manor and imprisonment of those responsible. Civil cases only result in financial compensation. And the risks for us? Greater, but the potential impact is also much greater. If we win a criminal case, we ensure the manor can never hurt anyone again. Martha, who had followed all these discussions with intense attention, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Harrison, I need to confess something that may affect the case. Everyone turned to her, and Julian felt a chill in his stomach, fearing yet another revelation that would change everything. "What is it, Martha?" "I wasn't just a housekeeper when I started working for the Sterling family. I was a registered nurse who had lost my license." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Julian felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet again. "How did you lose your license?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice professional but tense. "Because I reported irregularities at the hospital where I worked. When no one took my report seriously, I documented evidence and took it to the press. The hospital retaliated by questioning my mental competence and managed to get my license suspended." "The hospital where your mother was a patient?" Julian asked. "No, a different hospital. But the irregularities were similar. Unnecessary medication, negligent care, covering up problems to protect the institution's reputation." Mr. Harrison took notes quickly, his face showing both concern and excitement. "Martha, this could complicate our credibility if the facility finds out and uses it against us. But it also establishes a pattern of moral courage and medical expertise that strengthens your testimony." "There's more," Martha continued. "During these 15 years, I kept my medical education current through online courses and professional literature. Everything I documented about Mrs. Helena was done with real medical knowledge, not layperson's intuition." Julian looked at the woman he had known as a housekeeper for 15 years, realizing she was actually a qualified medical professional who had sacrificed her career to work in his home for reasons he was only now beginning to fully understand. "Why did you never tell me you were a nurse?" "Because I needed the work and knew many people wouldn't hire someone with a history of trouble with previous employers. And because after a while I realized that being a caregiver in a family was as important as being a nurse in a hospital." "Martha, can you get your nursing license back?" "Perhaps. With the evidence we've collected about the facility, I might be able to prove that my previous report was legitimate and that my license was suspended out of retaliation, not incompetence." The complexity of the situation was growing exponentially. Julian realized he wasn't just fighting to protect his mother, but was at the center of a case that could reform the treatment of vulnerable seniors across the state. The investigator, Gregory, arrived at that moment with news that would change everything once again. "Mr. Sterling, I have information you need to hear immediately." "What did you find?" "Oakwood Gardens Manor is in negotiations to be sold to an international corporation that operates similar care centers in several countries. The sale is scheduled to happen in 3 weeks. "What does that mean for our case?" "It means, if we don't act quickly, all the facility's assets and liabilities could be transferred to the new corporation, making it much harder to obtain justice or compensation." Mr. Harrison stood up abruptly, his face showing genuine alarm. "Gregory, do you have details on this sale?" "The corporation is called Vanguard Elder Care. They have a history of buying institutions with legal troubles, restructuring under new names, and continuing similar operations with a new corporate identity." "It's a way to escape legal liability?" "Exactly. And if the sale goes through before we file our lawsuits, we could miss our window of opportunity." Julian felt panic rising in his chest. After a week of building a solid case, discovering it could be invalidated by a corporate maneuver was devastating. "What can we do?" "We need to drastically accelerate our timeline. Instead of weeks or months of preparation, we have to file a preliminary injunction to stop the sale and begin criminal and civil proceedings within days." "Is it possible to do that without compromising the quality of the case?" "We'll find out, but we have no choice." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, the next 72 hours were a whirlwind of legal activity. Julian's home was transformed into an improvised law office, with lawyers, investigators, former clinic staff, and medical experts working around the clock to build a case that would normally take months to develop. Mrs. Eleanor, surprisingly, became the calm center of the storm. She offered coffee to exhausted lawyers, comforted former employees who cried as they reported abuse they had witnessed, and repeated her testimony as many times as necessary without losing patience. "Mom, aren't you tired of all this?" Julian asked during a break in deposition preparation. "Julian, for the first time in years, I feel my life has purpose again. I may be old and confused sometimes, but I can still help people. Are you afraid of what might happen when all this becomes public?" "I'm afraid of what might happen if we don't speak. How many other mothers, fathers, grandparents are suffering right now because we kept silent?" His mother's perspective humbled Julian once more. At 73, after months of trauma, she was demonstrating a moral courage he wasn't sure he possessed. On Monday morning, Mr. Harrison and his team filed an emergency petition with the federal court, seeking an injunction to stop the sale of the clinic and initiating both criminal and civil proceedings against the administration. The clinic's response was swift and aggressive. By noon, Julian had been served notice of 3 separate defamation lawsuits, an investigation for kidnapping, claiming he was holding his mother against medical advice, and a writ of mandamus to force Mrs. Eleanor's return to the clinic. "Mr. Harrison, is this normal?" "It's aggressive, but not unexpected. They're trying to overwhelm us with legal issues, to force us to give up or make mistakes. And if we make mistakes, then they win. The sale goes through, and other families suffer what you've suffered." The pressure was intense, but it had developed its own momentum that kept everyone focused. Martha coordinated the medical aspects of the case with professional efficiency. Julian handled the legal and financial matters, and Mrs. Eleanor provided the moral testimony that gave meaning to the entire effort. On Tuesday, they received their first significant victory. The federal judge had granted a temporary injunction preventing the sale of the clinic until a full hearing could be held. "What does this mean?" Julian asked. "It means we have time to present our case properly, and that the clinic can't escape liability through a sale." "And the lawsuits against us?" "They're also stayed until the main situation is resolved." The judge recognized their clearly retaliation against legitimate whistleblowers. The victory brought temporary relief, but also intensified the clinic's attacks. Private investigators began following Julian and Martha. Reporters showed up at their doorstep, asking questions about unfounded allegations against a respected institution. "Martha, do you have family that could be affected by this exposure?" "My only family was my mother, Mr. Julian. I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain if we achieve justice. And if we lose, if the clinic manages to prove we're wrong, then at least we know we tried. But look at Mrs. Eleanor. She's better now than she's been in years. How can they be wrong about that?" It was true. In the 3 weeks since his mother had returned home, Julian had seen improvements in her condition that the doctors at the manor had said were impossible. She was more lucid, physically stronger, and emotionally more stable than she had been in months. On Wednesday, they received news that completely changed the nature of the case. Gregory had discovered financial documents suggesting the manor was deliberately inflating diagnoses to justify more expensive treatments and longer stays. "Mr. Sterling, I've found evidence that patients with minor conditions were systematically reclassified as severe cases to maximize insurance reimbursements and family payments. Is that fraud?" "That is large-scale criminal fraud, and it explains why your mother was diagnosed with severe dementia when her actual condition is much milder." Mr. Harrison examined the documents with growing excitement. "Gregory, with this evidence, we're not just dealing with medical negligence. We're dealing with a systematic fraudulent operation that may have affected hundreds of families. What does this mean for the case?" "It means we now have the interest of the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office. This is no longer just a civil lawsuit. It's a criminal investigation that could result in arrests and the permanent closure of the manor." The magnitude of what they had discovered was daunting. Julian realized he had stumbled upon something much bigger than caring for his own mother. He had uncovered a network of exploitation that extended far beyond his family. "Mr. Harrison, how much personal exposure does this bring for my family?" "Substantial. You will be the key witnesses in a high-profile federal case. Your lives will be examined publicly, and the manor will do everything to discredit you." "Mother, do you still want to proceed knowing this?" Mrs. Eleanor looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "Julian, when your father died, I promised him I would raise a son who would do the right thing even when it was hard. Now you're giving me the chance to keep that promise." "Martha, Mr. Sterling, my mother died because I didn't have the courage to fight the system when it was necessary. Now I have that chance. I won't waste it. The decision was made. They would proceed with the case, regardless of the personal consequences. On Thursday, Julian's life changed in ways he had never anticipated. The story had leaked to the press, and his home was surrounded by television reporters, journalists, and photographers. Mr. Sterling, is it true you're suing the manor where your mother received care? Mr. Sterling, what evidence do you have of mistreatment? Mr. Sterling, how do you respond to the manor's allegations that you are exploiting an elderly mother for financial gain? The last question made him stop at the entrance to his home. He turned to the reporter who had asked it. My mother is better now, living at home with loving care, than she was for 8 months in a manor that cost a fortune. What financial gain is there in spending less money and getting better results? But the manor alleges that Mrs. Eleanor is being influenced by dishonest employees with hidden motives. I've known Martha for 15 years. If she were dishonest, she would have had thousands of opportunities to harm me during that time. Instead, she risked her own job and safety to save my mother. The manor also alleges that Mrs. Eleanor Sterling is not mentally competent to make decisions about her own care. Julian felt anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to respond calmly. My mother is more competent and lucid now than she has been in months. If they want to question her mental competence, they can do so in court, where we will have medical evidence to prove she is far better off away from the manor. When he finally managed to get into the house, Martha was waiting for him with a worried expression. Mr. Julian, Mrs. Eleanor was very upset seeing all that commotion on television. Where is she? In her room resting, but she wants to speak with you. Julian found his mother sitting in the armchair by the window, but this time she wasn't looking at the garden. She was looking at the television, where images of their home appeared on the news along with commentary about the case. Julian, perhaps we should stop this. I don't want you to suffer because of me. Mother, we're not doing this just for your sake. We're doing this for all the people who are being mistreated right now as we speak. But what if we're wrong? What if the manor is good and I was just too confused to see it? The doubt in her voice broke Julian's heart. The stress of the public exposure was making his mother question her own perception of reality, exactly as the months of gaslighting at the manor had done. Mother, look at me. Are you confused now? No, I'm thinking clearly. When are you more lucid? When you were at the manor taking several medications a day, or now, at home, taking only what is medically necessary? Now, definitely now. Then trust the lucid person you are now when she says the confused person at the manor was being mistreated. The simple logic seemed to reassure Mrs. Eleanor. She nodded slowly, regaining the determination she had shown in previous days. You're right. I can't let fear make me question what I know happened. On Friday, they received news that completely validated their decision to proceed. The federal prosecutor's office had initiated a formal investigation into Oakwood Gardens Manor, and other families had begun to come forward with similar experiences. Julian, we've received calls from 17 families in the last 24 hours, Mr. Harrison reported, all with stories practically identical to your mother's. 17 families? And that's just the beginning. As the story spreads, we hope more people will find the courage to speak up. Martha was organizing the reports coming in by phone, and each story visibly affected her. Julian realized she was reliving the loss of her own mother through every family that called. Martha, do you need a break? No, Mr. Julian. Every call reminds me why we're doing this. An 82-year-old lady called me crying because finally someone believed her when she said she was mistreated at the manor. Her family didn't believe her. They thought it was paranoia related to dementia. When they saw our story on television, they realized she had been telling the truth for months. The magnitude of the impact they were having grew by the hour. Julian realized they weren't just seeking justice for their family, they were giving a voice to dozens of people who had been silenced and ignored. Over the weekend, the legal team worked to prepare a case that now included multiple families and evidence of systematic fraud. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and it would be a decisive moment for determining the manor's future. Julian, we need to be prepared for the manor to present counter-evidence at the hearing, Mr. Harrison warned. They'll bring medical experts, loyal former employees, maybe even other family members who had positive experiences. How do we prepare for that? We keep the focus on objective evidence, medical exams, financial records, testimony from multiple independent sources. The truth has a consistency that's hard to fake. What if they manage to discredit our evidence? Then we lose and others will continue to suffer. But we have a strong case, Julian. We will not lose. On Sunday evening, Julian sat with his mother and Martha for a final conversation before the hearing that would decide everything. Mother, tomorrow you will have to tell your story in front of many people, including representatives from the manor. Are you sure you're ready? Julian, I spent months being afraid to speak. Tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, I will not be afraid to tell the truth. Martha, you know they will try to discredit you for having lost your nursing license. Mr. Sterling, I lost my license for doing exactly what we are doing now, exposing institutions that mistreat vulnerable people. If that discredits me, then so be it. And if we lose, what do? We try again, Mrs. Eleanor answered simply, because some things are too important to give up on. On Monday morning, Julian, Martha, and Mrs. Eleanor headed to the federal courthouse for the hearing that would determine not only the fate of their family, but potentially the fate of hundreds of other families who had entrusted their loved ones to the care of Oakwood Gardens Manor. The courtroom was packed, as families of other patients occupied the front rows, many holding pictures of loved ones who had been mistreated or had passed away at the manor. Reporters filled the press section, and the manor's lawyers occupied an entire table with documents and experts. When the judge entered, the silence was absolute. Julian held his mother's hand, feeling it tremble slightly, but her expression remained determined. This court is convened to consider petitions for a permanent injunction against Oakwood Gardens Manor, and to determine if there is basis for criminal and civil proceedings against the manor's administration, the judge announced. Mr. Harrison rose to present the opening case. Your Honor, we will present evidence that Oakwood Gardens Manor operated as a fraudulent enterprise that systematically mistreated vulnerable patients to maximize profits. This evidence includes testimony from multiple families, financial documents proving deliberate inflation of diagnoses, and medical testimony demonstrating that patients were harmed by inadequate treatment. The manor's attorney, Mr. Lawrence Whitaker, a 50-year-old man wearing a $3,000 suit, rose to respond. Your Honor, Oakwood Gardens Manor has served the community for 15 years without a single substantial regulatory violation. The plaintiffs represent families who, tragically, could not accept the difficult medical realities of loved ones with severe degenerative conditions. This is an attempt to find culprits where only the natural sadness of aging and illness exists. The two presentations established clear battle lines. On one side, allegations of systematic abuse and fraud. On the other, claims that families in denial were looking for scapegoats for difficult medical situations. The first testimony would be from Mrs. Eleanor. Mr. Harrison helped her to the stand, where she swore to tell the truth in a clear, firm voice. Mrs. Sterling, can you describe for the court how you felt when you were a resident at Oakwood Gardens Manor? I felt like an animal on a farm, she replied, her voice carrying a pain that silenced the entire courtroom. They would wake me with painful injections, force me to eat rotten food, and when I complained, they would increase my medications until I could no longer think straight. Did you try to contact your family during your stay? Every day, but they always told me my son was too busy to speak with me, or that he had asked not to be disturbed. How did that make you feel? As if I had been abandoned by my only son. Julian felt tears burning in his eyes. Hearing his mother publicly describe the pain of abandonment he had inadvertently caused was devastating. Mrs. Sterling, how do you feel now, living at home? I feel like a person again. I can think clearly, talk to my son, eat good food. I feel alive for the first time in months. Mr. Whitaker rose for cross-examination, and Julian could see he intended to be aggressive. Mrs. Sterling, you have a diagnosis of dementia, correct? Yes, but not as severe as they said at the manor. But you admit your memory isn't perfect. My memory isn't perfect, but I know the difference between being treated with kindness and being mistreated. Don't you think it's possible your perception of events could have been affected by your medical condition? Mrs. Eleanor looked directly at him with a clarity that surprised the entire courtroom. Young man, I raised a son, built a family, managed a household for 50 years. I'm not stupid just because I'm old and sometimes forget things. Some people in the audience chuckled quietly, and even the judge seemed impressed with the answer. Mr. Whittaker quickly changed strategy. Mrs. Sterling, is it true that your housekeeper convinced you that you were mistreated at the manor? No one convinced me of anything. Martha saved me when I was lost on the street. But the memories of what happened at the manor are all my own. But don't you think someone with financial interests could influence your perception? Julian saw his mother stiffen in her chair and realized Mr. Whittaker had made a tactical error. Martha worked for our family for 15 years, earning an honest wage. When she found me on the street, she risked her job to help me. If she wanted money, there were much easier ways to get it than caring for a confused old woman for free. The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, but it was clear Mr. Whittaker was failing to shake Mrs. Eleanor's credibility or determination. The next witness was Martha. Julian felt growing anxiety as she approached the stand, knowing the defense would try to destroy her credibility because of her suspended nursing license. Miss Miller, is it true you lost your nursing license due to issues with a previous employer? I lost my license for reporting medical irregularities that were harming patients. It was retaliation, not incompetence. But officially, you have no valid medical qualification, correct? Officially, no. But my medical knowledge and experience didn't disappear when my license was suspended. Miss Miller, why didn't you call medical authorities when you found Mrs. Sterling on the street? The question made Martha hesitate for a moment, and Julian realized it was a vulnerable point in their case. Because I knew official authorities would take her back to the manor without questioning whether she was being well treated there. So you took the law into your own hands? I took a lost and frightened mother into my arms and cared for her as any decent person would, regardless of the legal consequences, regardless of anything except doing what was right. Mr. Harrison rose for redirect. Miss Miller, during the 2 weeks you cared for Mrs. Sterling at home, did her condition improve or worsen? It improved dramatically. She gained weight, regained lucidity, stopped having nightmares. In your professional opinion, based on years of medical experience, was Mrs. Sterling receiving adequate care at the manor? In my professional and personal opinion, she was being systematically mistreated in ways that violate all standards of decent medical care. The testimony of Martha was followed by statements from former clinic staff, family members of other patients, and medical experts who had examined Mrs. Eleanor after her discharge from the facility. Dr. Arthur Vance provided devastating medical testimony. Doctor, what is your medical assessment of Eleanor Sterling's current condition? Eleanor is in exceptionally good condition for someone with her diagnosis. Her level of cognitive function is consistent with mild dementia, not severe, as was reported by the clinic. How do you explain this discrepancy? Excessive medication can create artificial symptoms that mimic severe dementia. When that medication is gradually withdrawn, the artificial symptoms disappear, revealing the patient's true condition. In your medical opinion, was Eleanor being medicated appropriately at the clinic? Absolutely not. The levels of sedatives in her system when I first examined her were dangerous and medically unjustifiable. The most powerful testimony came from Mary Miller, one of the other families who came forward. Mrs. Miller, can you describe your father's experience at Oakwood Gardens Manor? My father entered the facility walking and talking. 3 months later, he was in a wheelchair, too sedated to recognize his own children. What were you told had caused this deterioration? That it was the natural progression of his dementia, that we should be grateful for the specialized care he was receiving. Did you believe that? At first, yes. We were paying millions of dollars. We trusted they knew what they were doing. It was only when we heard the Sterling family's story that we realized we had been deceived. When it was time for the defense to present its case, Mr. Whittaker called a series of witnesses designed to discredit the allegations against the clinic. Dr. Gregory Thorne, the clinic's director, denied all allegations of mistreatment. Dr. Thorne, how do you respond to allegations that patients were sedated unnecessarily? We follow rigorous medical protocols. Any medication administered was based on professional medical assessment and family consent. Did the families always consent to the treatments? Absolutely. We have documentation for all consents. Mr. Harrison rose for cross-examination. Dr. Thorne, how many times did Mr. Julian Sterling visit his mother during the 8-month stay? I don't have that specific number. 3 times, Dr. Thorne. 3 visits in 8 months. How can there be informed consent when the family has barely any contact with the patient? Mr. Sterling was frequently traveling on business. We maintained regular communication by phone. But Eleanor Sterling never spoke to her son by phone during her stay, did she? Not all patients are in a condition to maintain telephone conversations, but she was in a condition to write letters to her son which were never sent. Dr. Thorne hesitated for the first time. Patients often write letters that are not appropriate for sending. Inappropriate in what way? Content that could be distressing to family members, based on distorted perceptions of reality. Dr. Thorne, did you read those letters before deciding they weren't appropriate? That would be a violation of patient privacy. Then how did you know they were inappropriate without reading them? The question created a moment of awkward silence. Dr. Thorne had clearly contradicted himself. Our policy is not to send correspondence that may cause families unnecessary distress. A policy that essentially silences patients who want to communicate concerns about their treatment. A policy that protects families from unnecessary anxiety. The defense presented 3 medical experts who defended the clinic's treatment protocols, but Dr. Harrison established that none of them had personally examined Eleanor Sterling or other specific patients mentioned in the case. The most dramatic moment came when the defense called a family who had had a positive experience with the facility. Mr. and Mrs. Beckett, what was your experience with Oakwood Gardens Manor? Excellent, Mr. Beckett replied. My mother-in-law received wonderful care there. Did she improve during her stay? She did not improve. She had advanced Alzheimer's, but she was treated with dignity and affection. Mr. Harrison approached for cross-examination. Mr. Beckett, how often did you visit your mother-in-law at the facility? Daily. And did you have unrestricted access to her at any time? Yes, always. Mr. Beckett, did your mother-in-law ever complain about the treatment at the facility? No, never. And if she had complained, would you have taken those complaints seriously? Of course I would. Mr. Harrison made a dramatic pause before the next question. Mr. Beckett, do you know other relatives who visited their loved ones as frequently as you did? Some, yes. And those who visited less frequently, were their experiences different? The question made Mr. Beckett hesitate. I don't know. I didn't talk much with other families. But did you notice differences in treatment between patients who received regular visits and those who did not? Objection. Speculation, Mr. Whitaker intervened. Sustained, the judge ruled. But the question had planted the seed of a crucial idea. The facility might be treating patients differently based on the likelihood of family supervision. After 2 days of testimony, the time came for closing arguments. Mr. Harrison stood to summarize the prosecution's case. Your Honor, the evidence presented reveals a systematic pattern of abuse and fraud. Oakwood Gardens Manor operated 2 standards of care, one for patients with active family supervision, another for those whose families were kept at a distance through deliberate policies of isolation. Eleanor Sterling was a victim of the second standard, oversedated, isolated from her family, kept in conditions that artificially deteriorated her to justify more expensive care and prolonged stays. But this case goes beyond one family. Dozens of other families have come forward with identical experiences. Former employees confirmed these practices were administrative policies, not isolated failures. We ask this court to protect vulnerable families by permanently shutting down an institution that has betrayed the trust of people in their moments of greatest need. Mr. Whitaker stood for the defense's closing argument. Your Honor, Oakwood Gardens Manor has served the community for 15 years. The plaintiffs represent a small number of families who, understandably, seek explanations for their loved ones' suffering. Dementia is a cruel disease that deteriorates the people we love. It is natural for families to look for someone to blame, especially when they did not fully understand the severity of the condition. Eleanor Sterling improved at home because she is in a familiar environment, surrounded by people she loves. This does not prove she was mistreated at the facility, only that she is happier at home. Shutting down an institution that has helped hundreds of families based on unfounded allegations would be an injustice to the entire community. The judge announced he would reach a decision within a week. Julian, Martha, and Mrs. Eleanor left the courthouse not knowing if they had managed to convince the court that the truth was on their side. During the week of waiting, Julian discovered his life had changed irrevocably. The exposure of the case had made his family a public figure in the fight for the rights of the elderly. They received daily calls from other families with similar experiences, from lawyers offering help, from journalists wanting interviews. "Julian, do you regret starting all of this?" Martha asked one afternoon as they organized more testimonies from families who had come forward. "No. Regardless of what happens, we did what was right. And if we lose, then we'll keep trying until we win." Mrs. Eleanor, who was resting in a nearby armchair, suddenly joined the conversation. "Julian, even if we lose in court, we've already won the most important thing." "What's that, Mother?" "We've recovered our family. You've become the son I remember from childhood again, someone who fights for what's right. Martha discovered she's a heroine, not just an employee, and I discovered I can still make a difference in the world." His mother's words touched Julian deeply. She was right. Regardless of the legal outcome, they had recovered something fundamental that had been lost years before, a connection based on love and shared purpose. On Friday, they received the call they had been waiting for. The judge had made his decision and would announce the results on Monday morning. "Mr. Harrison, do you have any indication of what the decision will be?" Julian, the judge, maintained a neutral expression throughout the proceedings. It could go either way. "And if we lose, we appeal, and we keep fighting." Over the weekend, Julian spent precious time with his mother, talking about memories from his childhood, about mutual regrets, about hopes for the future. They were conversations he should have had years before, but was finally having. "Mother, I'm sorry for putting you in that manner." "Julian, you made the decision you thought was best at the time. I can't blame you for trying to take care of me. But I should have visited more. I should have paid attention. What matters is that you're paying attention now." Martha also reflected on the changes in her life. "Mr. Sterling, regardless of what happens, I want you to know that these last few months have been the most meaningful of my life." "Why?" "Because I was finally able to use everything I've learned. As a nurse, as a daughter who lost her mother, as a person who understands suffering, to truly help someone." "Martha, when all this is over, what do you want to do?" "I want to get my nursing license back and work with the elderly, but in a different way, perhaps by creating a care center that does everything the right way. Would you be interested in creating that with me?" The question came out before Julian had time to fully think through the implications. But the moment he asked it, he realized he had found a new purpose for his life. "Mr. Sterling, are you serious?" "Completely. I have resources. You have knowledge. My mother can be our first patient and consultant on how the elderly want to be treated. This would change everything. Perhaps it's time to change everything." On Monday morning, Julian, Martha, and Mrs. Eleanor returned to court for the last time. The atmosphere was tense, with the gallery packed with families, reporters, and lawyers awaiting a decision that could set a precedent for similar cases across the country. The judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock, carrying a bulky document that clearly contained his detailed decision. "This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented during this hearing," he began, his voice echoing through the silent room. "The case presents fundamental questions about the care of vulnerable people in our society and about the responsibility of institutions that profit from providing such care. After analysis of the medical, financial, and testimonial evidence, this court has reached the following conclusions. Julian felt his breath catch as he waited for the words that would determine not only his family's fate, but potentially that of hundreds of other families. First, there is clear and convincing evidence that Oakwood Gardens Manor operated practices that violated basic standards of adequate medical care. Second, there is substantial evidence that these practices were systematic, not isolated aberrations. Third, there is evidence of financial fraud through the deliberate inflation of diagnoses to justify unnecessary treatments. Fourth, there is evidence that the facility operated deliberate policies to limit communication between patients and families, preventing proper oversight. Julian felt tears of relief beginning to form in his eyes, but forced himself to keep listening. Therefore, this court orders the immediate closure of Oakwood Gardens Manor until substantial reforms are implemented and certified by independent medical authorities. This court also orders a full criminal investigation of the facility's administrators for medical fraud and abuse of vulnerable people. This court orders financial compensation for all affected families to be determined in subsequent hearings. Finally, this court orders the creation of an independent oversight program to monitor similar institutions funded by the facility as part of the ordered reparations. The courtroom erupted in tears, applause, and exclamations of relief. Julian turned to his mother, seeing pride and satisfaction in her eyes. "We did it, Mom. We did it." "No, Julian. You did it. You proved to be the son I've always been proud of." Martha was crying openly, being embraced by other families who had come forward during the trial. "Martha, are you ready to start our care center?" "More than ready, Mr. Julian. More than ready." When they left the courthouse, they were surrounded by reporters, but this time Julian was prepared with a statement. "Today justice was served, not just for my family, but for all families who entrusted their most vulnerable loved ones to institutions that betrayed that trust. But our work doesn't end here. We will use everything we've learned to create a new model of care that treats the elderly with the dignity, love, and respect they deserve. Because we've discovered that true value isn't in the money we spend on care, but in the love we put into that care." In the months that followed, Julian kept his promises. He used part of his millions of dollars to create Eleanor's Haven, a small family-like assisted living residence that operated on principles radically different from traditional institutions. Martha regained her nursing license, this time with support from medical authorities who recognized her courage in exposing harmful practices. She became the medical director of Eleanor's Haven, implementing care protocols that prioritized human dignity over operational efficiency. Mrs. Eleanor became the center's first resident, but also its lead consultant on how the elderly wanted to be treated. Her lucidity continued to improve, proving that much of what had been attributed to dementia was actually the result of over-medication and an inadequate environment. Eleanor's Haven quickly became a national model for elder care. Families came from across the country to learn about its practices, and other similar centers began opening using the same principles. Mr. Gregory Thorne and two other administrators of Oakwood Gardens Manor were convicted of medical fraud and sentenced to prison. The facility was permanently closed, its assets used to compensate affected families and establish the independent oversight fund ordered by the court. But the deepest impact was personal. Julian discovered that caring for his mother and other elders gave him more satisfaction than any business he had ever built. Martha found a way to honor her own mother's memory by helping other families avoid the pain she had experienced. And Mrs. Eleanor discovered that her later years could be her most meaningful, using her experience to protect others and to rebuild her relationship with her son. One morning, 6 months after the court's decision, Julian was having coffee with his mother in the garden at Eleanor's Haven. Martha joined them after finishing her morning rounds with the other residents. "Julian, do you regret anything about what happened?" "Only one thing, Mother." "What?" "That we didn't start this journey years earlier." "Martha, what about you?" "Also just one thing. That I didn't have the courage to do this when my own mother was suffering." Mrs. Eleanor looked at them both with the wisdom that only comes from experience and hardship overcome. "You can't change the past, but look at what you've done with the present. You've saved dozens of families from going through what we went through. You've created a place where people like me can grow old with dignity. You've turned suffering into purpose. That's what matters. Not when you started, but that you never gave up. In that moment, Julian realized he had found something he had always been searching for without knowing, not just financial success, but real meaning, not just a career, but a calling, not just a family, but a shared mission that gave sense to everything they had lived through. The morning sun illuminated the garden where his mother watched the golden maples bloom again, where Martha planned improvements in care for her residents, where he himself had discovered that the true value of a life is not measured by what one accumulates, but by what one gives. And for the first time in decades, Julian Sterling was truly home. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Julian made the right decisions? We would love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.